Nature has supplied us all with defensive and autocorrective mechanisms, and if we will use them, we can escape from many of the pressures and tensions which are making life difficult at the present time. One very simple example of this autocorrective process is the visual function of man. We all know that if we stare at any object long enough, we will develop optical fatigue. And if this is continued, we may even finally accomplish a kind of autohypnosis. This situation is corrected in nature by the tendency of the eye to constantly move. Our focal length changes with every change of interest, every change of point of view. We read, we hear a sound, we look up, the eye changes its focus. As a result of this constant focal change, the eye is prevented from developing extreme tensions. This is one of the reasons why we have to be a little careful in the use of our eyes. If we allow optical tension to become too great, it will result in almost complete bodily fatigue. This is a problem with industrial life, in which we have developed a number of arts and sciences and processes which to a measure fatigue the eye beyond its normal capacity. The optical process tells us that nature is constantly attempting to maintain a degree of inner relaxation by diversification. And we can take this thought into other departments of life. We know, for example, that the individual with diversified interests is less likely to develop extensive or excessive tensions. The narrower the field of interest, the greater the probability of neurotic pressure, the greater the probability of fatigue due to too much one-pointedness, or the concentration of the mind upon one objective too continuously. We have long felt that this use of the mind to specialize intensely is one of the privileges that we have as human beings. It is true that the mind is capable of a great deal of specialization, but after this reaches a certain degree, we do get tension and fatigue and the loss of mental acuteness. The mind, becoming tired, is no longer able to function as effectively as would otherwise be the case. We are getting into this situation more and more in modern education, where the extreme pressure of the curriculum is definitely working a hardship on the health of the student. It means that by degrees we lose area in favor of penetration. The eye is capable of considerable penetration, but if we lose optical area, we will ultimately exhaust the resources of the eyes. The same is true of the mind. If we permit the mental point of view to become too restricted, we then begin to fatigue ourselves internally. And I have noticed that this fatigue, due to mental restriction, nearly always results in a debility of some nature. The individual who becomes tired is less optimistic. Fatigue depresses our psychic acceptances. The tired person does not see the world in as bright a light as the individual who has more abundant energy. Thus, wherever fatigue sets in, a kind of despondency is likely to come with it. The individual becomes restless, he becomes irritable, and he becomes less optimistic. In this loss of optimism through tension, nature attempts to reassert the optimum for man by causing the attention to shift, fully realizing that these changes of point of view are in themselves almost as helpful as complete rest in restoring the balance of faculties. If we become, therefore, too set in any attitude, this attitude will appear to us less and less happy, less fortunate. If we concentrate too intensely upon any subject or object, we are inclined to become critical. We are inclined to use the faculties beyond their normal capacity and to develop a series of possible irritations. Sometimes the irritations are due to the frustration which comes from intensive consideration of almost any subject. No matter how much we think about things or how much we know about them, if we keep our minds on them too continuously, we are liable to exhaust our own ability to interpret the values of these things. We come to a point of mystery, we come to a degree of uncertainty, and gradually the mind loses its focal power, the power to not only to see, but to interpret what is seen, to make some kind of constructive use of the testimonies that are brought in by the sensory perceptions. The mind, in the same way, when allowed to become too set, too fixed upon any objective, too crystallized in any attitude, rapidly loses perspective, becomes fatigued, and out of this, in turn, the mental attitude is debilitated. This has a special meaning for the chronic worrier. And about this person we want to have a few words to say this morning. Actually, it is useless to tell people not to worry. When situations arise in life which seem to cause real and deep anxiety, these situations can seldom be laughed off. They are not the kind of occurrences which we can take lightly. Some of our worries are quite real, others are largely imaginary. But whether they are real or not real, once we become fixed in our attention upon them, they become serious, important, and a little terrifying in most instances. As we cannot simply refuse to accept facts or our own interpretations of facts, we must find other ways of correcting the worry tendency. The individual himself, in a normal state, does not want to worry. If he wanted to worry, he would find more of satisfaction and less of misery from it. Of course, if he becomes a hypochondriac, he then loses his perspective and makes worry one of the principal occupations of life. This, however, again, produces no good and can be demonstrated to be the source of a great many evils. But to begin our problem of trying to get in behind the worry situation and change it, our first suggestion, therefore, is based upon nature itself, the importance of diversification. The larger the area of interest that we have, the more easily we can shift the mind from one focal point to another. After a subject that is serious or important or even menacing has been given due and thoughtful consideration, there comes a point where we can do no more, but we can keep on fussing. We can gradually go into a kind of blind funk over the whole thing. We gradually become obsessed by the magnitude of the problem, which seems to close in on us and become something that imprisons our thoughts and our emotions. If in this critical moment, when consideration has given us all that it can offer, then it is best to shift the mental focus. Sometimes this requires a bit of an effort, and the less mental interest we have, the more the effort, because we have nothing to turn the attention to. If, for example, we have a difficult child in the family, and their conduct is of concern to us, there are only 2 or 3 possible things we can do. We can first of all make every reasonable effort to correct the situation. we can use all of the experience and judgment that we possess. We can be certain in our own minds that we have neglected no counsel that might have been helpful, that we have called upon any and all expert advice that might contribute anything to the solution of the problem. Having used the mind, therefore, to the maximum, having done all that it is in our power to do, we have to come finally to a point of decision. We either have to allow ourselves to go into a long cycle of fears, of worries, and anxieties, which will not be productive, or we must shift the point of attention. When we shift this point of attention, it does not mean that we are running away from the problem, because fortunately the mind can be shifted back as need arises. But it is better not to keep the mind fixed upon the problem for too long a period at a time. The moment we shift away, we relax the mind, we rest those faculties which are involved in the problem, and perhaps the next day we can face the situation with new insight, or we will think of things that we have not previously recollected, which may have a constructive bearing. So that wherever a problem begins to close in, simply, voluntarily, and energetically change the mental point of view. This doesn't mean that we deny the problem. It doesn't mean that we deceive ourselves in any way, or that we take attitudes which are inconsistent with our own convictions and therefore which we do not really believe. It simply means that we learn to use the mind more effectively. We gain this additional effectiveness through allowing it to rest, allowing it to change its focal length in order that it may have energy and power to come back to the problem later with greater positiveness, with greater depth of insight. So each life is faced with this matter of diversification. The person who has the least fortune in these matters is the one who cannot find an adequate object upon which to shift attention. Now, our remote ancestors, concerned with some deep and apparently real and necessary decision, very often carried the thought as far as they could, and then they simply relaxed and turned to God. They did this by means of prayer. The person who found no reasonable answer to his immediate situation found a certain relaxation, a certain release, by turning the attention to the area of faith. Faith itself is a therapy against fear and worry and anxiety. The individual suddenly becoming God-conscious in himself shifted his mental perspective from the importance of the problem to the solving power of the divine presence. Now, in other nations and among other cultures, perhaps the mind did not turn directly to God. Perhaps it turned to nature itself, where the person under a heavy problem going out into the forest or into the mountainside simply was still and attempted to experience within himself the grace of a universal therapy that is present everywhere if we can adjust our own consciousness to it. But one thing is obvious: our forefathers in emergency readjusted their own consciousness wherever this was possible. They found that by so doing they got a new line of thought in motion. They changed from a negative to a positive point of view. To their own helplessness, they turned for a time. But then they turned from this to the realization that with God or with heaven, all things are possible. And in this reaction, this change, they did have a powerful therapy. This is one of the difficulties that we see arise in a materialistic era, where the individual no longer has the escape to the presence of the divine power. He is not likely to call upon this as much as in ancient times, although in emergency we still call upon it more frequently than most people imagine. It is the same in sickness. The individual under medical care goes as far as he can with available therapy. The doctor does the same. But there comes a moment in critical ailment where it is no longer possible to sustain the inner integrity simply by means of medication. The individual has to change his point of view. He has to turn from the doubts and fears concerning himself to a stronger positive attitude of belief towards something else. And we observe that this frequently cures the ailment, producing almost miraculous results. One of the miracles is simply the result of releasing the mental emotional organism from the tension of anxiety. If the person feels that he is at peace with life, if he feels that he has made his peace with God, very often he simply relaxes, and out of this relaxation makes a splendid recovery. Whereas otherwise his own tensions might prevent the therapy from being effective. All the way along then, we have to decide in one way or another what our escapes from personal attention are going to be. Nearly all worry is in some way or other a highly personal state of mind. It is a state of mind in which we fear evil either to ourselves or to those we care for or to some situation that is of the greatest personal concern to us in our daily life. We fear the loss of loved ones. We fear the loss of health. We fear the loss of money or of security. We fear the animosities of our adversaries. We fear the evils of the times. We fear war and pestilence and crime. All of these fears, however, center upon ourselves in some way or another. In fear and worry, it is always the person himself who is in the center. As long as he remains in the center, with everything interpreted in terms of what it means to him, there is very little possibility of release. He has to move away from this negative center which he has gradually built up in himself. Good, successful, industrious worriers are usually well trained. They have made quite a profession of it. If they had worked as hard at something else as they have at worry, they would be experts in a more productive field. Actually, therefore, worries begin with small matters, ill-considered, and gradually habits enlarge or develop or intensify. So that the moment we notice the tendency to unreasonable anxiety, we must either do something about it, or it will come upon us slowly like a chronic ailment. Ultimately, we will have the greatest difficulty in controlling our own attitude, because attitudes become more or less automatic. And once we achieve a certain degree of intensity in an attitude, it takes over. We no longer possess it. It possesses us. We must try to break this sequence, therefore, before it has reached a chronic state. If we notice children are developing the worry habit too early in life, it is very important to diversify the interests of those children as much as possible. It is necessary to give them things to think about that have no direct bearing upon themselves. The bearing may be there, but not the kind that intensifies immediately into an anxiety. Thus we find that in children and in adults both, this constant effort on the part of nature to drive us to diversification, to get more and deeper activities and interests on a larger area. This is very important today, where the individual, in the course of business or in the course of the ordinary patterns of life, not only falls into ruts, but has a tendency to fall into the dilemmas which are associated with these patterns, which have now become general. The conduct of the world today is such that for most individuals, situations arise which are the cause of anxiety. We cannot live as badly as we do now without having worries, without having things constantly upsetting us, giving us definite anxieties. If worry, however, is allowed to develop beyond a certain point, it becomes pathological, and we find ourselves worrying about matters which perhaps have some validity in themselves, but are completely out of our range. We can do nothing about them anyway. And where this isn't obvious, then a worry itself is hardly productive. But people will always say that they just can't help it, that these situations arise and there's just nothing they can do. They read the paper every morning, and no one can read the paper and not worry about something before they reach the obituary notices. The conditions are such that every day we are confronted with unpleasant news. We are confronted with situations that might well appear to react unfavorably upon ourselves. If we are kind-hearted, well-intentioned, and idealistic people, we also become gravely concerned over the misfortunes of nations and of peoples and of groups. We become indignant at the various mistakes and fallacies that are now heaped up in every part of our way of life. This becomes what you might term the public worrier. The individual simply cannot accept life as it is. And because he cannot accept life as it is, he lives in continuous rebellion against it. And because rebellion is one of the most fatiguing of all attitudes, rebellion almost always ends in despondency. It ends in a fatigue situation in which the individual becomes less and less optimistic, and the problems become greater and greater as he considers them. Thus we have to sit down somewhere along the line and do what our wiser brethren of all times have done, that is to take hold of our own lives, our own thoughts and our own emotions, and discipline them. We have to have the power to correct them. And this power of self-discipline, this sense of the strength or assurance of self in the presence of emergency, has been definitely undermined by the collectivity which has gradually taken over the pattern of our living. We are becoming less and less resourceful as persons, less and less secure in the ability to live our own lives. We become more and more involved in the common affairs of things, more and more dependent upon governments, upon systems, upon policies. We have lost by degrees the individual courage to live a personal life as we understand it and as we think it is right. Because we become dependent, we have more worries. The more that we have to depend upon the conduct of other people who are themselves unadjusted and uncertain in their actions, the more difficulties arise and the more anxieties accumulate. So the person has to gradually set up some kind of a personal relationship with his concept of life, with the situations that he knows are going to arise. He must be prepared for them with some kind of an attitude other than anxiety. Otherwise, in our kind of world, anxiety will ultimately become the principal killer, the greatest cause of disaster for all of us. Anxiety, working psychosomatically upon the body, can also reduce it in a short time to a condition of hopeless invalidism, unless we do something to change the pattern. We find usually that an individual faced with a really important decision, where he knows that he has to do something, or he's going to be in very serious trouble, this person rises to the emergency and does something. We have emergency resources. If we are really sold to an idea, we will try to do something about that idea. there's no reason why all of our long-established habits should be negative ones. The same qualities within our natures which can cause us to settle in negative ruts can also cause us to develop positive patterns. It does not take one bit more energy to think constructively than it does to think destructively. It does not require any more energy to plan than it does to worry. But for some reason, we find it easier to worry, simply because throughout life we have neglected the training of positive faculties. We have worried since the day we were born, but constructive thinking has never been really cultivated. We have depended almost entirely upon the broad, constructive, protective patterns of our society. The child has learned to depend upon the elder for decision, therefore has not developed the strength of personal decision. The individual going through life has learned to depend upon the protections of society. If he is in legal difficulty, he calls on the lawyer. If he is in health problems, he calls on the doctor. If he is too depressed or emotionally upset, he calls on the psychologist. Little by little, he has learned to depend upon other circumstances, persons, or conditions for support. But he has continued to hold in his own name the right to break down. This is the difficulty. He has not learned how to escape the negative part of his nature, even though he has tried to develop means of combating the consequences of this after it becomes desperate or difficult. The discrimination, the understanding that we have to have, simply we have been too busy, too preoccupied, too indifferent to develop. As a result, the mind naturally functions in a negative way. It has never been taught to be a positive instrument. And if it thinks and functions in a negative way, it is going to fall into anxieties, worries, and fears inevitably. The mind, therefore, has to be re-educated as part of the process of life. It is very difficult to do this under an emergency, when already the pressure of situations may be so great that the person is totally bewildered. The answer, of course, is to be prepared in advance. The whole theory of education is that the individual shall be equipped to face conditions that arise. Education is intended to make it possible for us to face the economic and social problems of life. The purpose of education is not that the individual shall be free from all problem, but shall become greater than most of the emergencies that arise within the areas covered by education. We have to do the same thing in our basic thinking. There is no way in which we can suddenly call upon resources we have never developed. If a person who has never developed the body properly, has never developed any muscular or physical strength, is suddenly overtaxed, the body simply cannot support him. If, however, he has a long background of physical culture, if he has trained and conditioned the body, he is able to meet some extraordinary physical emergency with a very good probability of survival. Thus, we have to begin working with worries before we have them. We have to take out of life, as far as possible, those uncertainties which are ultimately going to express themselves as worries. And the wonderful time, as we have suggested, to work with a worry is when we do not have it. Because under those conditions, we are not under any exceptional pressure. We probably go through life realizing that we have a tendency to worry, but there are times along the way when worries are few, when it looks for a moment as though everything is going to go well, and about the only real worry we have is that the condition will not continue. This seems to be another cause of anxiety. I know people who are worried to death when something good happens to them. They are sure that it is announcing a disaster of some kind in disguise. But actually, if we can find the comparatively placid moments of life, or those in which worries are just medium, not intensive or excessive, that would be the wonderful moment in which to build against worry. At that time, we are not under particular stress. We are not likely to develop excessive involvements about our own attitudes. We are simply in a good condition to build a better way of life. It's as though a person taking physical culture under consideration discovers a time in which he is reasonably well, and at this time sets about his program of physical improvement. It is hardly a good plan for him to go into excessive calisthenics just after he's broken a leg or something of this nature. There are too many hazards against the success of his undertaking. So if you are not worrying at the moment, forget as far as you can the factor of negative thinking. Take out of your life the idea that the mind is used or should be used for purposes of anxiety. And while things are running reasonably well, go straight to the source of your own mentality, and in the comparative relaxation of an optimistic moment, try to begin to discipline the mind. Get to work planting within the mind these ideas and these policies which are going to serve you in good stead a little later, when you do have some demand upon them. It's very much again like the individual reaching retirement age. I know persons that have been checking off the calendar for years as retirement comes nearer and nearer. First it is 2 years away, then it is 2 months away, then it is 2 weeks away, and then crash, it is here. And these individuals really do not know what they intend to do afterwards. Their anxieties about their futures, their confusion, and perhaps the confusion of their friends and family. The family won't know what to do with them either when they're home all the time after being out at business for 40 years. This is again another difficulty. No one is ready for it. Everyone has thought about it. Everyone has checked off the calendar. Everyone has watched the day approaching, and no one has done anything. This means that when the day of retirement does come, the individual is more or less lost. After all, he can cut the lawn every day for a week, but after a while this loses interest for him. He has no valid interest. To meet the problem of retirement and to experience the period of life after 60 to 65 as the richest and most important part of our living, something has to be done about it long before the critical time arises. This means that as we also realize that life is going to have problems from the cradle to the grave, the time to get to work on the problem-solving mechanism is early, before the problems themselves have exhausted our resources and discouraged our souls. If we wait too long, age and loss of energy, and finally the gradual decline of faculties will make it impossible for us to achieve the end that we want, or at least make it very difficult. So the individual who is retiring at 65 should be hard at work building character at 30 and 40 and 50, preparing himself to do the things that he wants to do and to have useful and important things that he really does want to do. If he has none of these dynamic interests, and he suddenly discovers himself with mental, emotional, and physical leisure, he will 9 times out of 10 go negative. He will begin to consider, for example, that this retirement is the first step toward the grave. He will learn from his associates that most of them die within a few years of retirement. This is one of the reasons why we can occasionally balance the budget on insurance and things of that nature. The retirement problem is in many instances little better than a death sentence. People know this, so they prepare to die instead of to do something about it. No one seems to have the courage to break the patterns. And yet, if we do not break them, they will break us, as certainly as we face them every day. Let's say then that the first problem that we face in connection with anxiety mechanisms of all kinds is that every individual must have more than one interest, must have more than one real interest, not a dabbling interest, not a time-killing interest, but at least one subsidiary, valuable interest. He must have, according to a kind of music composition, he must have a dominant and a subdominant. In his life, he must have a major and a minor in his living, as he has theoretically in his education. He must from the beginning have sufficient mental enthusiasm and emotional enthusiasm to spread his interests beyond the immediate. Now, in a sense, we find this tendency to limit interest more common with women than with men. And as the result of that, we have certain ailments that are more common with women. We find that the woman has a tendency to invest all her interests in persons near to her. She has an inclination, for instance, to center very largely in home and children. These two become really synonymous terms. She develops a certain series of systematic pattern relationships, relationships in which life is physically occupied a very great part of the time. And as, however, the children have a tendency to grow up, and the number of children has a tendency to diminish, as in modern society, this situation leaves a bad place that has to be filled in some way. We find that the average woman is not a hobbyist. In fact, she is rather proud of it, which is not the thing that she should be proud of at all. She does not have a range of interests that are going to step in the moment family situations relax. She does not have a dynamic new activity to take over the moment the responsibility for a child ceases. She may have 3 married children who are now out living their own lives, yet she has not found 1 or 3 new interests as great as those children to continue with her own living. Therefore, she gradually injures those children that she already has. She becomes perhaps the doting grandmother who tries to take on a new generation of the same interests that she has had before. She may try to fill her life by babysitting for her children, allowing her children to be free of responsibilities that they themselves should be carrying and she should not be carrying. Little by little, she continues to overmother these children or grandchildren because she has not a new vital interest. This means that she also takes on most of the anxieties and most of the worries and most of the problems of her own adult children. She finds habits setting in so strongly that instead of being liberated into new interest, she is simply deserted by the conditions or patterns which have become meaningful to her. This situation is more frequent with women because it occurs during the periods in which a man's life is still tied up in his business, in which he has to go every day to his office and face problems. Therefore, she has an interval before the retirement time of a man. And in this interval, she can very often develop a deep-seated neurosis unless she is very, very wise. Now, in the meeting or combating of this tendency, the tendencies of loneliness, the tendencies of disorientation, the tendencies of simplified living, which no longer require the full use of time and mental energy. In this situation, the negative patterns begin. And after a while, they get to be so unpleasant that the person makes some kind of a desperate move. one of the most common desperate moves of these lonely people is to suddenly turn to religion. Not a constructive adjustment, not because religion is something that should be very important to them, but because religion offers some kind of consolation. They are looking for a nostalgic consolation. They are looking for something which will enable them to regard themselves as persecuted, neglected, or suffering from one of those noble virtues of the martyrs, by which they gain spiritual dignity in measure of physical discomfort. This situation has no essential merit. I remember many years ago I watched a pilgrim in an eastern country go to the shrine of his faith. He went to the shrine, stood in front of it for a moment, folded his hands in prayer, and in maybe 20 seconds he was gone. He had finished his little prayer and was gone. He happened to speak some English, so I talked about it with him a little later. I said, "That's a very fast prayer, you said, my friend. Is that the way you usually do it?" He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "Of course, I visit many shrines. Maybe I do this 100 times a day as part of my religious devotion." I said, "Well, isn't prayer usually a little more elaborate than this?" "Oh," he said, "not with me." He said, "I have very little to pray about, actually. After you pray every 15 minutes, you don't have very much left to pray about." But the subject of the prayer is very simple. He said, all I do when I pray is that I just fold my hands like this, and I bow at the shrine, and I say, 'Thank God for God.' That's all there is to it. I just give thanks that there is a divine power ruling all things. And I want that divine power to know I am grateful. So I say, 'God, I am grateful. Amen.' And go on to the next." And so I talked with him a little bit, and I found that this man had gone through quite an elaborate religious experience throughout life. But he had gradually learned that the only prayer that was really important was the prayer of gratitude. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't say, "Dear God, make my children more obedient." He didn't say, "Dear God, take away my enemies," or "take this pain out of my back." He simply said, "Dear God, I am grateful," and went on his way. There was no neurosis in this. It was a very simple act of devotion. And as a result of that, it probably meant a great deal to the life of this person who was dedicated to a pilgrimage. But in our Western thinking, our religion generally is not simply a profound statement of our rejoicing in the presence of the obvious truth of God. We lean, we fall over, we try to drape ourselves on some divine concept. And we have so long thought of this idea of casting our burdens on the Lord that we just keep on casting them. And in this, our religion doesn't help us very much. It simply becomes an opportunity to tell our troubles to somebody else. And whether this is a human person or a divine person, we have talked about ourselves from the beginning to the end of the whole conversation. So this isn't the kind of religion that helps, but it is the kind of religion that people often turn to. And it's not unknown for them to try to gain a life by supporting some religious movement, trying to forget themselves by becoming desperately involved in some organization in which they feel there is some good to be achieved. This devotion, this involvement, may be itself a very noble and sincere effort. But unless it brings some kind of a faith with it, unless it means that this person is doing this good work primarily because of respect and veneration for deity, and not as a means of escaping personal problem, unless this is rather clear inside, it often produces very little lasting good. The development of the neurosis keeps on, even though the individual has turned to some religious outlet. So we have to watch this constantly, or our real goal is not attained. What our real goal is that we must live a full, rich, basically optimistic life. Fully aware of problems, fully aware that we must bear our share of them. And yet we all know a few people who carry life graciously. And those are the people whose examples should be very important to us. The individual who has not experienced less, but has achieved more as the result of this experience. The only way we can do this is to build the basic disposition of spiritual acceptances within our own natures. So we say that these persons who are clinging to immediate interests and are being held up by the fact that they have given their complete mental energy to some particular objective, these people must learn that this process will end almost certainly in loneliness and suffering. The objects to which we attach ourselves are impermanent. The relations which we have with life are impermanent. And that which gives us consolation at one moment may be taken from us the next. And when we see this beginning to happen, we begin to worry. We worry because of its effect upon the total pattern of living. The individual who has very limited ability and has a very small area of influence fears the loss of a job because it's going to be hard for him to get another. Whereas a person who has a well-qualified background, who is able to fit in easily into many situations, is usually rather optimistic about his ability to find a new position if it is necessary. So the less we are, the more we have to worry about things that can happen to us. The more we are, the less we have to worry. So the problem of becoming more is forever close to us, and one that we must face every day of life. Actually, life today for Western man contains a greater amount of opportunity for diversification than ever before in human experience. We also have greater leisure. That is, leisure so far as actual activities are concerned. Most of our tensions, most of the sense of extreme busyness with which we are afflicted arises from our own nervous systems. Today we have the time to do almost anything within reason that we may want to do. We certainly have some time to be used in the unfolding of our own potentials to a greater degree than we have as yet unfolded them. It may be that we should give up certain wasting of time, which may interfere with this problem of solution. But it is far better to turn off the television or the radio or the high-fidelity set. It is better to miss a few social meetings. It is better to have fewer social entanglements if it is true that we need this time for the developing and maturing of our own character. To shut ourselves off from people for neurotic reasons is wrong, but to waste time in situations when a better use can be made of that time is also wrong. So it is perfectly possible and perfectly reasonable for the average individual today to enlarge his areas of thinking and feeling at almost any time he so desires. He can often use exactly the same instruments and media which today he finds comparatively useless. For example, I know individuals who do nothing but say that every radio, television program, everyone is horrible. Well, there are a lot of bad ones, let's face it. But I know other people who continually report the wonderful programs they have seen. So you mention these programs. Here's an opportunity to see how life is lived in the Hunza Valley. Or here's an opportunity to accompany a group of people in a wonderful exploration into archaeology or art or music or literature. But our neurotics never turn these programs on. They only turn on the programs they condemn. Because by so doing, they find something else to be unhappy about. And besides, as one admitted to me under pressure, these programs that made them unhappy were so interesting. Somebody was getting killed every moment. And when you know a number of persons that you wish were dead, there is a certain escape in seeing mayhem even on a television screen. So we are not using opportunity well. We have gradually developed attitudes which will not permit us to take interest in things that are interesting. We only want things that punish the nervous system, that excite or depress, or to create further neurotic tension. If we settle down and watch this procedure, changing our habits slowly but certainly, gaining greater control on the areas of our needs, we can do a great deal to help ourselves even under the commonplace incidents and situations that we now face and live with. Always also there is the leadership of self in these problems. And perhaps the greatest leadership of self that we can give to the individual is philosophy. 20 years ago, philosophy was regarded as little or nothing. It was simply an escape mechanism for the individuals who could not adjust to the glorious materialism of 2 world wars, a depression, and the atomic bomb. Philosophy was for the defeated. Philosophy was for people who just wanted to escape into some kind of an unreal world. Today we know this is entirely wrong. More and more, philosophy is becoming important in education, psychology, and religion. It is becoming more important in science, and science is becoming more aware of the fact that a philosophic interpretation of science is the only justification for science. That science, as we know it today, a rather cold, calculating device, has really no value in itself. That is, no enduring value. But every scientific discovery can be philosophized into a dynamic, and this is the point that is beginning to dawn upon educators and leaders in general. So where the person is confused, and everyone is more or less confused, even the experiences of growing up in childhood are most confusing, the confused person who has the wisdom to consider the importance of a philosophy of life at an early age, that is, certainly before the emergencies become ponderous. The understanding of the importance of building life upon a conviction, upon some general attitude about the reason for our own existence. The worrier generally has never considered the reason for being here. If he has considered at all, he has come up with the classic answer that he was born to suffer, which actually brings no answer to anything. And yet, the same person who is a chronic worrier may indignantly insist that he does believe in God, that he does believe in good, that he does have faith in his Savior and Redeemer, that he does believe that there are wonderful and beautiful things in the world. He insists that he has these convictions, and yet in his daily living they do not touch him. He is unable to bring them to bear upon his problem. Or if he does at all, he does it in such a lame way that it is of very little practical value. So a philosophy of life should come to the individual the moment in life that he realizes the possibility of attaining it. The first time he is confronted with the possibility of improving his internal pattern of existence, he should grasp at this opportunity with every instinct that he has. And it has always seemed to me that some kind of a basic philosophy of life should be taught in public schools, certainly in the high school grades. That there should not be an indoctrination, no, but there should be an inducement for the individual to realize that his success in life, his happiness in life, his adjustment to life, all these depend not upon society, not upon the paycheck alone, and not upon other people humoring him to death, but depends upon his own internal integration, that he must have this concept of value in himself. So the moment it is possible to have a philosophy, the moment we are aware that we can possibly possess it, we should work on it. And it's hard for anyone to reach maturity today without hearing about some philosophy, good, bad, or indifferent. It is almost impossible not to be exposed to the thoughts of the world's greatest, most influential minds and souls. So that there is no real excuse for the individual's indifference, except that he has not been trained to be interested. He has not been taught to believe or to realize that philosophy is his own protection. He has thought of it as another mental acquisition. He has thought of it only as a kind of abstraction which perhaps is ornamental to the mind but not particularly necessary. If he realizes its necessity, he will get to work with it. So if you find that there is a tendency to be a worrier, then it is most important that you work out as much as you can a secure philosophy of life that liberates you from certain unreasonable doubts which affect those who have no philosophic content in their own minds. A philosophy to be suitable to the need of the individual must inspire him to the maturing of his own nature. A philosophy which simply ends in an argument over abstractions is of no value to anyone. A study of philosophy which only opposes one school to another is not beneficial. We are not concerned just with the history of philosophy, or the biographies of philosophers, or the formulas in which they differ. What we are primarily concerned with is that phase of philosophy which bestows dignity upon life, which makes the individual a well-adjusted human being. There is really no other way of approaching adjustment except in some branch of philosophy. Whether philosophy is merely the folk wisdom of a people, the kindly experienced wisdom of the elder, or a more formal integrated system, philosophy is finally and ultimately organized common sense. It is the individual learning to sense the values, which, if once accepted, make life a more orderly and realistic experience in the better sense of the term realism. So if the need arises to give this any thought at all, and it does arise, and it will arise, then the basic philosophies of life must be considered. Philosophy itself is not only a study of universal procedures and an effort to explain the nature of first cause and the place of man in the unfoldment of existence. Philosophy diffuses or diversifies into almost every branch of human experience. Philosophy, first of all and most of all, explains and reveals the value of the richly lived life. Philosophy tells us that experience is the basis of wisdom, that experiences properly accepted and understood are themselves the great strengtheners of character, and that the individual's pressures that he has been struggling with are simply symptoms of the need for philosophic integration. So he can really start to work on these problems if he is so inclined. And the one end which he is seeking, whether it be through philosophy or religion, is a quietude within his own nature, a life of acceptances rather than of belligerent conflicts. Now, acceptance is not a negative thing. Most people feel that acceptance is a compromise, that we must never accept life. We must fight it to the bitter end. And the harder we fight it, the bitterer the end is going to be. Acceptance is the gracious acknowledgement of situations as they are. Acceptance is the ability not to demand the unreasonable. Acceptance is the bestowing upon others of the right to live as they see fit, without our being made miserable by their conduct. Acceptance is the ability to be patient in the presence of immediate obstacles. Acceptance is to remain sufficiently at peace within self to be able to interpret or examine a circumstance with the greatest possible insight and clarity. The real purpose of behind acceptance is to prevent the mind and the emotions from becoming disturbed. The moment the mental or emotional nature is disturbed, its ability to testify honestly to situations is injured. A perfectly smooth surface of water will reflect the surrounding areas accurately. But if the surface of the water is disturbed, the reflective power is lost. And when the mind is disturbed, its reflective power is lost. Therefore, the problem is always the greater the difficulty to be faced, the more perfectly we must be integrated to face it. If a situation is extremely critical, then there is still greater need for the individual to have the total availability of his own resources. And this total availability is possible only when the individual is relaxed. He can only do his best thinking when he has brought a condition of peace or poise to his mental life. He can only express his true affections most completely when these affections are expressed simply, directly, and without tension. This does not mean, as some people feel, that the undisturbed person is heartless. It is not that we are less concerned, but rather that we are so completely concerned that we want to do something valuable rather than dissolve in an emotional outburst. And worry, therefore, is a problem until it is emotionally or mentally deformed. Then it becomes a worry. A worry is also something that indicates a poor relationship between ourselves and the thing about which we worry. We do not worry about things that we have under control. We worry about things which have eluded our control, which must in some way be faced with less effectiveness than we desire. Worry is an old problem coming to a head that we can no longer control. Worry is an anxiety which we cannot accept graciously. So we have to try to reduce this pressure in our own natures. Now, we cannot reduce a pressure simply by telling it not to exist. This is the problem of your hypnotic drug and your sedation and your so-called pacifying or tranquilizing drugs. This is simply an effort to reduce tension by reducing consciousness itself. The individual who has become addicted to these worry-liberating drugs is simply an individual who is losing the keenness of his own faculties. he is being intoxicated by some kind of remedy as a cure for the fact that he cannot think straight in a sober state. This is no solution. And wherever a worry is simply blocked, you're going to have ultimately more neurotic pressure. The only good of the drug is that sometimes the worry is something that has only a temporary significance, and if the individual is carried through a crisis, the problem will not reappear in the near future. But even this is not a solution. It is merely an indication, a further symptom, that the individual cannot face life with a healthy consciousness. He must destroy part of his consciousness in order to survive. This is obviously not right. So in the working with this type of an anxiety problem, the real end is to use the consciousness rather than to destroy it. Actually, consciousness can solve problems. It can bring them to a proper conclusion, whereas the sedational drug can only cause us to be temporarily unaware of the problem, which, if it is a real one, will endure even longer than the drug can protect us. So here we have the real value of getting hold of solutional ideas. We cannot get solutional ideas on problems in particular unless we have them on life in general. So our acceptances arise from philosophy, and some phases of philosophy which approach very close to religion also strengthen these acceptances. We have to accept the world as it really is, and we cannot know the world as it really is until we have achieved an acceptance. It's a peculiar, almost vicious situation. It's a circle in which each part is heavily dependent upon the others. The person who has a proper quietude of acceptance can experience the facts of existence. The individual, of course, who has experienced the facts of existence is in a better condition to attain inner acceptances. So each sort of demands the other. And somewhere we have to break this pattern by some kind of an action of our own, or else it remains abstract to the end. So we must make one statement of acceptance. We have to accept something. We have to take some kind of an allegiance which breaks the equilibrium of these two factors. And once we have set one of them in motion, we can continue to extend our consciousness along the way towards greater insight. So in the beginning, we usually have to begin with an acceptance of something which we feel or believe to be important, but the fact about which we do not completely know. We have to accept something as a basis that we cannot be completely scientifically certain about, because the certainty comes at the end and not at the beginning. We cannot begin with certainties and work up. We have to begin with uncertainties and work through them. The individual does not attain adulthood first. He does not have a mature mind when he comes into this world. Therefore, he cannot think maturely in infancy. He has to grow, and in all respects, our certainties have to grow as we mature within ourselves. The child has to obey the certainties of the elder, because it has not yet attained a sufficient degree of insight to guide its own life. The mature person, who is still childish in wisdom, has to accept the certainties of those great teachers and leaders who have gained the universal admiration and respect of mankind. Therefore he must turn to some parental system of instruction until he is old enough to do his own thinking. Consequently, usually the person must turn to one of the great religions or philosophies of the world and form at least a loose association with it. He doesn't have to become fanatically addicted, but he has to find somewhere a pattern of life which to him is suitable. And usually his own instincts will tell him what seems to be the best for him if he will give these instincts a normal chance. So becoming increasingly acceptive of things and becoming increasingly quiet within ourselves, we are able to discriminate a philosophy of life or a way of conviction that is suitable to our own needs. Once we have made the decision, then this philosophy becomes our way of life. And we begin to develop an understanding of the values of experience and of the purposes for which we exist. Philosophy always is a panacea to worry. It helps the person to realize the workings of his own mind. Philosophy helps us to know why we worry. And as we find out why we worry, we also find out why it is rather foolish. Philosophy helps us to longer range perspectives on conduct. Philosophy helps the young person not to make the mistakes that will afflict his age. Philosophy helps the person to plan ahead, rather than to live in a constant imminent, which may be the basis of continuous apprehensions. Philosophy causes the person to gradually refrain from such habits or actions as will damage character, damage happiness, or destroy peace of mind. Little by little, philosophy takes over as a regulator of conduct. And as this philosophy may be comparatively an internal experience with very little support from society continuing its unphilosophic way, those striving for integration have to have a certain additional resource of willpower. The person who has internal conviction has to have the courage to live by it. But he will find in the long run that he will have fewer worries if he lives by conviction than if he tries to live without conviction. The moment we begin to compromise, our worries increase. And a monumental worrier is a person who has made monumental compromises along the way. So philosophy, step by step, brings the person into a relationship with fact, which is essentially factual. And where we achieve this end, the anxiety factors are greatly reduced. The thoughtful person is able to achieve acceptances. Actually, when something happens, he is more interested in the happening than he is in what it means to him. He sees in the happening the proof of a philosophy. He sees in the outcome of events the proof of the convictions that he holds. He gradually comes into the only fortunate relationship that he can hold with life: partnership. He begins to sense that if he will keep certain rules, the rules will keep him. He begins to recognize that he does live in an ordered, regulated kind of universe, that he is responsible for his own conduct. And the moment he breaks the rules of this responsibility, he opens himself to misfortune. As this becomes clear to his inner consciousness and to his common sense, he has many inducements not to continue the policies which have brought him into continuing difficulty. We can all make a mistake once, but if we continue to make it, it is an indication of our own feeble-mindedness. And the development of a philosophy gradually results in the development of a code which is a simple thing. The moment it becomes complicated and abstract and we have to quote everybody under the sun to sustain it, it is meaningless. The real philosophic code is one of a few basic principles continuously applied. We have certain principles, for example, that we know operate. We know definitely in nature that when we set certain causes in motion, we must expect their effects. There is no use weeping over these effects. There is no use regretting them. If these motions were set about long ago, when perhaps we did not know as much as we know now, this itself is regrettable. But nature is not holding this against us. Nature is not going to destroy us because long ago we did something wrong. Nature, however, will insist and must insist that this wrong be righted. And if through a certain attitude that was wrong, we got into a difficulty, we must gradually learn that that attitude is wrong. We are never going to be permitted to make mistakes and enjoy the consequences. If in our philosophy of life, then, we gain a certain honesty, we say to ourselves, all right, I owe a debt. I intend to pay that debt. I am perfectly willing to pay that debt. I was selfish in a certain situation. This selfishness hurt others. Now in the long cycle of life, this selfishness has returned to me because it was a habit set up in my own consciousness. I am perfectly willing to face the consequences. I understand now why I was hurt and why I hurt others. Having come to this understanding, I am perfectly willing to pay the bill. I do not expect to evade the consequences of conduct. I expect to grow from them. And what other people think about it is of secondary importance. The worrier must, in almost every instance, accept the burden of a reasonable fact. It is when he distorts this fact, however, that it becomes unreasonable. The individual who is worrying about things that seem to him to be completely unfair or unreasonable has generally overlooked something in his own conduct. Also, if he dramatizes the lesson sufficiently, he will destroy its meaning. If he dramatizes the truth for himself out of it by shifting all blame to someone else, or insisting that he is the victim of ill fortune, then he probably will have to go through the same experience several times. He will have to face the same trouble repeatedly because he has not learned its meaning for him. And nature will never let him rest until he has corrected the fault in himself, which has endangered his happiness and peace of mind. Nature wants its creatures to be integrated, to be self-sufficient beings, enlightened from within themselves by truth and insight. And nature will not permit the individual to make mistakes which might ultimately reach fatal proportions. The moment the mistakes begin to pile up, nature begins to fight back. Nature insists that the individual shall learn his lesson. And worry, therefore, is simply a misinterpretation of the values. That everything that is important should be faced with seriousness, with every prayerful determination to solve it properly, is true. We should never run away from the problem. We should never ridicule it. We should never deny it. We should never try to laugh it off. What we should, however, try constantly to do is to understand it sufficiently well so that it no longer frightens us. We should take the anxiety out of it, on the same grounds that we have to take the anxiety out of many emergencies in life over which we cannot exercise control. If we continue to be anxious about that which we cannot change, we will ultimately become ill. We will go so greatly against nature that nature forces itself to correct us. If, however, we begin to understand the reasons for things, we can accept them with peace of soul. We can accept the diversities of experience with a certain interest as the child faces the adventures of life. Life can either be a disaster or an adventure, and it can mean a great deal and produce some of these wonderful people that we do know, or it can embitter us and disillusion us, demoralize us. Life is like the effect of the ripening of the sun upon fruit. On the same tree, one apple ripens and the other rots under almost the same circumstances. And in man, in the experiences of living, one person matures and the other destroys himself, in the same world under the same general conditions. And it all depends entirely upon the characteristics of the person. So as a cure for worry, we don't try to tell a person not to worry. Rather, we try to equip him so that worry is not necessary. We try to give him sufficient strength of character so that ordinary problems are not overwhelming. And where a problem is too great for the individual to carry, where some emergency in life goes beyond the reasonable strength of the person, then it is their need of acceptances. They have to realize that they do not understand, but that actually the problem is just, whether they know it or not, whether they can see it or not. This problem has to be part of an organized program which is reasonable and right. For the problem, in the same way as the moment of joy, both arise from a divine plan, divinely and eternally administered. We cannot take the ground that the tragedy means that God has lost power over the universe. We have to realize, rather, that the tragedy is a major incident in the development of a human soul, and that the soul rising to these emergencies, to these critical moments, reveals its true insight. When it takes faith in that which is the substance of faith, when it accepts that which it cannot understand with grace and kindliness and spiritual insight, or if a way of solution reveals itself, that the individual has the courage to accept the solutional invitation and, living according to the highest principles that he knows, solve the matter sometimes the hard way. Whatever is right will assert itself, and wherever we allow it to assert itself, worry and indecision are no longer problems. So every person finally solves worry by building richness of character, richness that extends into many areas of interest, giving the person an opportunity to shift his point of view, to find relaxation and change from things which would otherwise be too intense. Definite unfoldment of resources in terms of appreciations for all the privileges and opportunities that come in life. Constant effort at self-cultivation through the enlargement of knowledge, through the enrichment of appreciation, through the perfection of skills, so that we have a full, rich, well-organized life in which there are purposes within us which can endure the loss of any outside purpose to which we have become addicted. If our final purpose is to grow, to perfect ourselves, and to fulfill the divine plan for ourselves, we will never be out of work. If we are perfectly certain that we are eternal beings, eternally growing, that everything that happens to us is part of a gradually increasing pattern of inner knowing, inner appreciation, inner value, we can slowly but surely outgrow the anxieties, the uncertainties, the fears which normally affect us. I know a man, for instance, who for many years wouldn't travel. He wouldn't go anywhere because he wanted to die at home. There was some mysterious virtue in the fact that he died in the small town in which he was born. After many years of this, I found out that he had taken a long trip and had returned safely. I asked him why it was or how it was that he had suddenly gotten over a 40-year phobia which would not let him leave the main street of his own town. Well, he said, one day I suddenly woke up in the morning and I said to myself, I said, Joe, it is just as far from this world to the next on any spot of the earth's surface. I am just as far from heaven at home as I am abroad. No matter where I am, when that moment comes, I'm going to move from one world to another, and it makes no difference where I am. And he said, this did something for me that nothing else in life has ever done. Suddenly, this strange fear, an unaccountable fear that seemed to make him feel that heaven was closer to the community where he lived than anywhere else. Not because it was a especially good community either, by the way. This had restricted this man's life. It was nothing but an attitude. And yet it had worked a terrible hardship on him. But fortunately he outgrew it with a victorious realization. And we all have to have these victories of realization. We all have to wake up sometime along the way and realize that attitudes that we have defended and held and catered to for years were pretty bad. And that these various anxieties and worries that we are constantly burdened with all rest completely in the hollow of a hand that has never dropped anything yet. That these problems are in us, not in the universe. And if we stop having these problems in us, little by little they will vanish from our race. They will vanish from our kind. Because what we call society today is nothing but this mass of problemed people, passing their problems on to each other like epidemical diseases. We cannot change these other persons, but the moment we change ourselves, we become new areas of constructive influence in this pattern. And when even a comparatively limited number make this change within their own natures, society begins to change, the world begins to improve, and situations that cannot be solved under present conditions can be solved if even a minimum group of human beings suddenly realizes its real place in the plan. We know these things are solutional because they have operated, they have worked. We know that the popular way of doing things has never worked. We cannot pick out of the pages of history or of human experience one single case in which negative procedures have ever really contributed to common good. They sometimes seem to have, but actually it was not part of the plan or the necessity that these things should happen. we also realize that wherever courage and integrity arise, good is accomplished. We realize that nations are created by courage and are finally destroyed by cowardice. We realize that great systems of ideals and hopes are built upon principles and fade away when these principles fail. Everywhere the individual is taught that to the degree that he keeps principles, he is safe. And if he achieves this situation, he doesn't have to worry. Worry comes to the person who has no foundation in principles. If he has the proper foundations, what we call commonly a worry, which is a frightening, stagnating thing, becomes really a problem to be solved, something to which we turn the best of ourselves. And if we do this, the problem is generally resolved very quickly. So the worrier should not try to stop worrying. He should try to build wisdom, build insight, build courage. He should enrich consciousness, create new outlets for his activities, and slowly come to understand the truth about existence. And when he gets to understand this, he will be truly a thinker and not a worrier. He will be a wise person rather than a frightened one. And he will build his faith and his life upon principles rather than upon those shifting situations which, when they collapse, result in worry. It's all within the person. And if he will keep his principles clear and strengthen them every day through life, he will have this strength when he needs it. And he will see these principles operating in the universe when otherwise he might be frightened at what appears to be some kind of universal injustice. There is no injustice in the universe. The very nature of it and the nature of its creator establishes the pattern of justice. We cannot assume that there can be any justice apart from or different from the great creative procedure of which we are a part. Therefore, it is our responsibility to find this justice and not to doubt it. And if we find it, we are strong and we are able to handle our own lives successfully. Well, time is up, so I think we'll have to stop. Now, I'd like to make a few announcements, and it looks like I've been handed quite a few, so I'll ask you to be patient for a moment. Our subject for next Sunday morning is Love Has No Enemies. This is our Palm Sunday subject, and we're going to begin with the discussion of charity as charitas, or love, which begins in the heart and flows out to the common good. I also want to call to your attention that the next Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock here in the auditorium, we're going to have that long-awaited moment of burning the mortgage. So we hope all of you will be present as this important document is consigned to the flames. So we hope you'll all be here on Sunday. Now, I'd like to also point out that next Sunday also, in connection with this, we're going to have an open house in which there will be opportunity to see our various exhibits. Articles will be available for purchase if anyone is interested. And at 2 o'clock, after the mortgage burning ceremony, we will have a discussion here. I'm going to give a short talk on magic and medicine, based on the exhibit that we have in the library at this time, which we hope you will slip in this morning and see. There are promises of very special refreshments for next Sunday also, and anyone who would like to add or provide anything toward this refreshment project should communicate with the Hospitality Committee. I'd like to also point out that we are soon to have an exhibit of art at the Otis Art Institute, 2401 Wilshire Boulevard. It will be open to the public on March 26th. The general theme of the exhibit will be woman. and art relating to this theme will be exhibited, including a number of items from our collection. Also, on the tables in the library today, the surumono will be offered. These are the Japanese greeting cards for various festive occasions. The old ones are very rich in symbolism and beauty, and many of them make very nice gifts or are suitable for framing and artistry of your own. So we recommend them to your consideration. Also, we have a nice line of Easter cards and things of that nature in our gift shop, and always something new is being added, so we hope you will visit there. I'd like to also note that Dr. Bode is going to give two special lectures on Tuesday evenings. On Tuesday, March 17th, he will speak on Mohandas Gandhi, whom we knew personally and worked with. And on Tuesday, March 25th, he will speak on spiritual philosophy of the Zoroastrian religion. Friends are invited to attend these interesting lectures. Also, I'd like to announce the new issue of our journal, which is now on the table with the summary of our world trends predictions. Our booklet, The Quiet Way, which we think would be really quite helpful in connection with this morning's discussion, and also our book, Self-Unfoldment. These emphasize the importance of this more serene approach to life and suggest various ways by which it can be cultivated by the individual. General text on this subject, our publication, Right Thinking, is also recommended. So we hope you will visit our exhibit, and the friends who are keeping the exhibits open on Sundays for your benefit. We hope you will all tell your friends about the open house next Sunday, and that you will be here in good style to attend the burning of the mortgage. And so until then, we thank you, and we know you are waiting with anticipation till next Sunday. Thank you very much.